Welcome to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures, with thought leader and award-winning author Yvette Bethel. This podcast provides you with insights and ideas you can use to reinvent your culture through trust and the principles of interconnectivity, flow, and balance. At a time when the world is rewriting the rules of work, traditional leadership practices are not enough. It's time to perceive persistent challenges through a new lens. It's time to evolve.
All right, so hello once again, and welcome. This is your host, Yvette Bethel, and the topic for this episode of Evolve is biomimicry of the mind, rethinking leadership through the brain's design. And we have with us our friend. I can't call you a guest anymore. You've been on, this podcast so many times. But friend and colleague, we have with us Edwin Clamp. Edwin, tell everybody about yourself.
Hi, Yvette. It's good to be back. I always love being on your podcast. Thanks for inviting me. Yes, so Edwin Clamp. Yvette and I have a relationship that revolves around thinking deep thoughts. And so I could tell you about my life, but it's not as much fun as all of the great thoughts that we discuss. So, but I'm easy to find online if anyone wants to connect with me. Edwin Clamp.
All right, and we'll come back to that at the end.
Yeah.
But, all right, let's jump right in. In simple terms, because nobody knows about biomimicry, or very few people know about it. So please tell us, in layman's terms, what does biomimicry of the mind actually mean?
Okay, yeah. So biomimicry is where we design something. It could be a product, it could be a system that will mimic an aspect of nature. Mm-hmm. So, and I think the reason that this is an important principle is one, of course, if it's happening in nature, this artifact, whether it's a product or a process, works obviously in terms of how it flows. But also nature is very, very good at doing things very efficiently. So when we're mimicking nature in many respects, we're mimicking very efficient systems and processes. So it's something that we should be thinking about.
Can you give us an example?
Yes. So again, this is, it's really hard when we talk because we go into so many different things, but what we've seen, particularly with computer-aided design, CAD design over the years, is you would have engineers design things that are very boxy and straight lines and et cetera, and they did a good job, like making planes and such. But there's a whole new generation, and it's just kind of folding in some of the AI stuff. It's called generative design. And what you see is that engineers are able to design things like a car frame or an airplane frame that look much more like what we would consider our bone structure to look like. So if you look at a bone and you were to, like, say, cut one in half, you're going to see all of these kind of structural filaments and elements that kind of make up cells. And the reason that's there is because our body will actually build our bones to be the most efficient for how we live our lives. So if you were to look at the bones of a runner versus the bones of a weightlifter, they all look different. And it's because our body is taking the physiological feedback, more weight or repetitive stress, and it's adapting our design, our bone structure. Literally, it's adapting each person's bone structure to the demands that are placed on them. So we see this principle has been used in, for example, designing a race car chassis. So it's only using the materials that are most optimized in the shapes that are most optimized. Wild looking cars, but very, very high performance. And I think, as I was reflecting on this, like, why would organizations be interested in this? Because ultimately organizations are competing in a competitive space. And when we're looking at inspiration for how to make our organizations more efficient, it makes sense that we would look at how organisms are more efficient, which is this biological mimicry.
If someone never studied neuroscience, what's one thing, and you can connect this to biomimicry if you like, but what's one thing they should know about how the brain works?
I think one of the things that stands out most to me is what we have learned from science versus maybe how we intrinsically conceive the brain to work. So for a long time, we literally thought the brain was, that we can borrow a term from computing, central processing unit, or CPU. We thought everything came into the brain, it got processed, and then it got sent back out again. And it kind of relates in terms of how we structure our understanding of things to like leadership principles, where you have the big man theory. You got the guy at the top who directs everything. So it's this very antiquated schematic of how things are organized. And now what we see that we're actually learning about neurobiology is a lot of the functions that our brain is performing are distributed. They're not centralized. And they're also specialized. So we have all different bits and pieces of our brains that do specialized things. And how that delegation of duties happens in a person's nervous system is really fascinating. And it's antithetical to that kind of centralized model of thinking that I think many of us were taught was the way our brain works.
So does it also take into consideration, like some people think that our gut has some kind of a function that's similar to a brain or a heart, or like the brain heart gut connection, like how does that all factor?
Yeah, there again, I think this is what we've been learning in biology is, in fact, these processes that we considered to be psychological processes or neural processes are really pretty far distributed down into your intestines, which has got a tremendous amount of nervous tissue in it, and different parts of our body. So it's kind of like when we think about the old way that maybe you and I were taught in high school, the brain is the command center of the whole body. It's just not like that. There are all different pieces of our body, pieces in our spinal column,
Right.
pieces near the nerve endings that are actually processing information and making choices and making decisions. And I think what we've missed overall is we think that the old kind of this big man theory of like centralized power assumed that the person at top knew everything and was aware of everything, which is not how organizations work.
Right.
They really don't work like that. So when we look at kind of biomimetic neuropsychology, it's remarkable because it really describes how organizations work better than some of these more simplified models. And it makes sense because organizations are filled with human beings. So looking at how human beings work should explain to some extent how organizations naturally kind of end up functioning. It's what we do, basically.
Would you say that one of the more simplified models would be command and control, which kind of strips out all of these, I guess, idiosyncrasies, for lack of a better word, or nuances, maybe?
Well, I think it's yeah. So maybe a precursor model for how we understood how we function as humans, and also how we built our systems, our organization was this command and control system. And I'm not saying that's a bad one, but it is a simplified model. And as complexity increases, those models tend to break. So it makes sense that as our for example, when you look at a simple organism, they have simple systems. When you look at a complex organism, they have complex systems. It's the same with our organizations. Like, I'm sure that there are organizations out there, like a factory that makes rulers. They can operate on a very simple paradigm, a mechanistic clockwork paradigm, because they're just producing the same product all day long. There's not a lot of complexity there. But once you start getting into banking and consultancy services where you're dealing with a lot of change and a lot of complexity, now we need to say, okay, what metaphor for our systems works best with this level of complexity? And I think that's why I find a lot of meaning in this neuropsychology as a model, because it's very, very adaptive. It's like, as human beings, we excel at dealing with complexity. That's what we do. Very complex social interactions. This is essentially the root of our survival strategy, is we're able to adapt. We're able to deal with changes and complexity.
Let's take an example of something, because our brains learn by being predictive, making mistakes, and adjusting. But in command and control models, that's not there's not a lot of room for making mistakes and adjusting. You need to follow, the steps.
Yes.
And I think, well, the question is, how can leaders use this same loop of predicting, making mistakes, and adjusting to kind of break out of the command, oppressive, suppressive kind of model and make a shift? Because
Yes.
that's not an easy break to make. That's actually complex. It's more than complicated.
Yes, it is. It's so funny, Yvette, because when I look at this, I see organizations, like, for example, when we're talking about biomimicry, we're definitely talking a lot about feedback loops
Right.
and learning processes. So you can look at today's organizations and you can be like, okay, they did some A/B testing on something, or they did a debrief on whatever. So you can kind of see these rudimentary feedback loops in there. But I think there's a piece that we're missing. There's a piece of mentality there that is almost like, I think we got most of this process figured out. We're just dialing it in. We're just getting to the highest level of efficiency by addressing some of these issues. And then once we've got all the settings done, we can kind of like leave it, and this process should be good. And I get that, but we are living in a much more volatile world. So the shift that's happening is maybe not so much on this distributed feedback loop process wherever it's happening in the organization, but it's more like the leadership attitude or the epistemology, like how they see all of this being structured and their role in that. Because ultimately, when you look at the principle of our nervous systems, it's completely centered on continual learning.
Right.
So an organization that's operating on this more suitable paradigm is really going to be a learning organization that becomes central to the very culture of the organization, that they're constantly testing hypotheses, adapting it. It sounds, we've talked about the Cartesian Newtonian mindset, which is kind of based in science. It sounds science-ish. You say test the hypothesis, but it's beyond that. We're not rigidly doing this where it becomes part of the culture, where we're continually reflecting on what's happening and trying to learn from every single experience.
That continuous learning, and we talked about this in another conversation, is really connected to continuous change, which happens because of the feedback loops,
Mm-hmm.
and them intersecting with each other, creating, movement and
Right.
the opposite of stasis. So I think what you're talking about with regard to the continuous learning is change is happening and is being integrated in, and people are learning from it, and then more is being integrated. So it's this incremental growth that's continuously happening and change.
Yeah, and when you look at the neurobiology there, what's happening is that continuous learning is happening throughout the organism.
Right.
Like I reach for a glass and I'm I miss it by 3 inches, and then I move my hand
Yeah.
to it. Okay, my mind has just made a little micro adjustment there, and next time I reach for the glass, I'm going to hit it right on.
Right.
So that is happening, but also what is happening in our nervous system is we have this gating process to say, okay, this little thing can be handled right here. But maybe there are other things, sensory pieces of information or things that we're learning that have to be elevated. And this is what eventually comes into our consciousness. So
Mhm.
it's not only about the functional unit learning from it, it's also knowing when that information needs to be distributed more widely so that everybody else can also adapt to that.
Let's tie emotion into this conversation because every organization has what I call an emotional landscape.
Yes.
Um, and the brain has a specific center that deals with this. But
Mhm.
so the brain switches between modes of exploration, focus, and threat.
Right.
And how do these modes show up in workplace behavior?
Well, that's a good point. I think to what you're saying there is we need to recognize that we have different functional modes. We have flight and fight mode,
Right.
emergency, like it literally changes our physiology to be more focused, to have more resources available for whatever's coming at us. We have relaxation mode, which engenders some other physiological changes. So we have modes. It would make sense then, in a biomimetic way, that organizations should also be having modes. Like for example, now we're going to see all kinds of organizations being challenged by AI. And so, from an organizational point of view, this could be an existential crisis for them. They can shift their modes. Maybe they were like, it was great. They were living off of their, you know, all the investments they've been getting in and kind of like living the dot-com lifestyle. It's been great. And all of a sudden, this threat comes along. They need to shift the modes into, okay, we need to address this threat. So we're going to increase our focus. We're gonna cut we're gonna bring all of our available resources to bear on the problem. It's kind of a modality thing, and once that threat has been addressed, our nervous system can go back into whatever the other mode is, production mode, or you know reflective mode, for example, which is important to learning. So it's okay for organizations to switch between modes, but what I have seen, I'm sure a lot of our listeners have, organizations kind of get stuck in the flight or fight continually. They're always putting out fires, and they're never able to to get to that place, which is really important, where you can kind of step back, reflect, learn, and then adapt ultimately to the changing environment. They spend their whole time in the flight or fight mode, or it's
Mhm.
not healthy for an organization to be there.
Fight or flight, and then people end up in survival mode, and then they burn out, and then,
Yes.
and then, and then.
So it's important for an organization to have a healthy balance.
Mhm.
That I mean, flight or fight is a survival mechanism. So it's not something we want
Yeah,
to preclude from an organization. There are times where that's really, really important, but you can't stay there all the time.
right. I'm going to shift to the conversation to attention. A lot of organizations, they go through strategic planning exercises, and I think that's a way of focusing the attention of the
Mm.
leadership team and everybody else on what matters. My question is, how is this aligned or not aligned with biomimicry? Um, eh, Naturally, is this something, the way that organizations do it, is that the way that the brain does it, or just
No.
a little bit more?
No, I think this is again an artifact of thinking because we tend to have this very linear way of thinking. So, you're going to sit in a meeting and everyone's going to talk about the strategy, the 5-year strategy, and they're going to chart the course over the next 5 years. And then at the end of the meeting, everyone's going to be great. Like, we're going to do this. We're going to go down this road for the next 5 years. That's a linear path that is assuming that the future is going to be predictable. And the world that we're living in right now is increasingly becoming unpredictable.
Right.
So I think what shifts there is, instead of, again, it kind of goes back to these big man vibes. It's like, I got this figured out. What I say is going to be in the next 5 years is going to be because I'm the big man. No, 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 no. We're now dealing with a very unpredictable landscape. Things are going to come along. Geopolitically, things are changing. Technology is changing. The workforce is changing. There's a lot of change.
Mhm.
So what shifts is not that you don't want to have strategy. You want to have an idea of what you're going, but the focus moves away from I'm going to dogmatically pursue the goal that was set to I kind of have a general idea of where we're going, and I'm going to be very responsive to the stimuli that I'm getting from my environment so that I can adapt and optimize my performance based on what's happening in the environment. It's a shift in thinking. It's a subtle shift because in both cases, there's this kind of long-term sense of direction. But to give you an analogy, you mentioned strategy here. In corporate strategy, we have this term blue ocean strategy.
Mhm.
And it's kind of it's basically saying there is nothing in the landscape that's going to get in your way. You can sit here and you can chart your course and you can just we're just going to turn the engines on and go to this destination across this blue ocean. You're not really hindered by impediments. Shift that kind of boat analogy to now your boat is stuck in a field of icebergs and it's foggy. You can't just go full speed ahead because you're going to crash into something. You've got to shift your efforts now to sensing. You're going to put people around your boats with binoculars and maybe long poles, and they're going to be feeling for icebergs and like, okay, ahead a little bit on the left, reverse engines. And it's much more adaptive in navigating. It's still the ocean, but now it's an ocean full of obstacles that are dangerous. Okay. So you respond to that by increasing your sensory perception around your ship. You can't just put the rudder where you want it to go and then go get a cup of coffee. You can't do that in a much more threat-laden environment. You've got to be shifting to sensing and making sense of those inputs.
Translate that into a business application. Like, what does that mean? Sensing and all of that in a
Um,
context.
well, I can give you an example. I know somebody very high up at one of the largest software corporations, product manager. They get, which is amazing, they get thousands of pieces of customer feedback a day coming in through their apps. And the mentality there in the organization is we're designing this product. This is our product. We're going to take it where we want it to go. Versus all of these thousands of people who are giving the input. I need this feature and I need this feature. And wouldn't it be great if the product did this? It shows the differences between those mentalities. Here you have a group of experts who think they have it all under control and they understand it better than anybody else. But then you have all the users of the product over here who say, no, we need something different, And so there's two, and in the end, it creates two very different outcomes. You have a product that, I mean, we've all seen this over the years. Company releases a great big fanfare product. We can think about IBM's OS Warp. For those of you who are older like me, it was an amazing operating system built with the best technologies, and nobody wanted to use it, right? And then you have other things that are very responsive to user input that just become like amazing, like Uber products that people just love using because it's meeting the needs of the customers. So it's very much about how you're handling that feedback. I mean,
Yeah.
this is traditional. I mean, this is not even like biomimetic. This is just straight up common sense.
In biomimicry, there's a term called a reflex arc.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is that, and how can organizations use that idea?
Yeah, so a reflex arc is simply when you need to have a reflective axis, like I take my hand and I touch a hot stove. The sensation of the heat on my fingers will trigger my nerves to fire, but that nerve signal does not go all the way up to my brain before it's responded to. It will go basically to my spinal cord, and the decision to pull my hand back takes place in my spinal cord, not in my brain. And so it's one of those distributed process that allows us, the benefit of this is it allows us to respond quickly. If it had to go up to our brain and then it had to be processed by our brain and then go all the way back down to our hand would be more severely burned, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So the principle there is that like we would translate this into business, there are certain functions in the business that should be able to operate quasi-independently with maybe some guardrails and guidelines from the top unit. If there is, like I may be getting this wrong, but I think the story goes like maybe the Waldorf Astoria in New York, they empowered their lowest level employees, the maids, the door people, to address customer issues directly, and they gave them a budget to do this, a small budget. If they could make solve a customer's problem, buy them an umbrella or whatever the case is, it made for a much better customer experience. Okay, so I didn't have to like go get a PO number to buy an umbrella, to give to this very important customer. I could just go and take care of it, and it improves in that industry. Quality of service is kind of the hallmark, so it improved their primary attribute there. You may see this. I mean, you could imagine different scenarios, whether it be like food manufacturing, something happens, food safety issue. They need to be able to do that, address that immediately. They don't need to wait over the weekend for corporate to get back and give them the green light. There are many different, it could be many different examples, but we would talk about this in a non-biomimetic way as empowering some of your frontline employees to address the issues directly without having to go through a whole bureaucracy.
What does the biomimicry lens change what good leadership looks like? Like if you were to, look at the big picture with biomimicry, what changes? What changes in leadership?
For me, the shift in leadership is away from knowing to learning. I think that's where it comes down, because and I'm not saying that there's not reasons for this, but oftentimes organizations will promote some of the most knowledgeable people within the organization to roles of leadership, which is great because knowledge is very important. But what we don't value is the ability of somebody to learn. So somebody could be very knowledgeable, but they're very rigid.
Right.
Like for example, let's look at what's going on in the software industry. We've got AI making a massive change,
Mhm.
You promote an old school developer who just likes to write the code by hand because they're in their head, they're like, this is better code. If we write all of this by hand and blah, 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 blah. Okay, that may be true, but they're going to get taken to the cleaners competitively because they're not going to be able to respond quickly enough.
Right.
So, in a situation like that, this mature software engineer may have a ton of knowledge and a ton of experience, but one of the more important attributes is not maybe how much they know, it's how quickly can they learn. And I think from the leadership point of view, it's not only how quickly can they learn, but how can they facilitate organizational learning. I think that's really, really one of the key points that comes away from here is we as organizational leaders should really be looking to help everybody else learn and increasing the rapidity of our learning cycles so that we're more adaptive. We can find our competitive advantages quicker when the environment changes. We can we can mitigate problems quicker before we get really badly burned.
That's an interesting approach because a lot of organizations will put some measurements in place around learning that have to do with output. What you're suggesting is really to be able to assess the capacity of the organization to learn, and there aren't that many tools.
No, I think it's a new space.
Yeah.
It's not individual learning. I was a number of years ago that I was doing educational consulting, global educational consulting. And I think one of my takeaways from that period is the success of the student had less to do with the organizations that they were in and more to do with their personal attitude of learning.
That's it.
If they were just curious, basically it comes down to this. If they were curious people and they liked learning, they would excel wherever they are. They could be at a local community college, they could be at Harvard. They're going to be actively driving the improvements they need in their life. I think within the organization is creating the culture where you are maybe selecting in curious people and creating a culture where learning is encouraged, not penalized. Because remember, learning comes from learning from mistakes. So a lot of cultures become punitive and they penalize people from mistakes, not see it as learning opportunities.
I would say that there's a category of learners that can be rigid. And I find it a lot with people that are in certain disciplines. They have a way of thinking and compartmentalizing and a lens that they use.
Yes.
I don't know that I would characterize that as learning.
Right.
I have to think about it some more, because that's to me gaining more knowledge about a topic.
Yes.
I think we need to be very clear on, because these organizations categorize this as learning.
Right.
And we need to be clear on what actual learning is and what the gathering of knowledge is. Because that group of people that learn in a very rigid and structured way, that are not necessarily curious, they just want to know more for other reasons.
Right.
We need to be mindful that there are different kinds of like a so-called learning, for lack of another term for it.
Yeah, and in education there is a hierarchy of learning, and basically the mastery of knowledge only comes about halfway up that hierarchy. Beyond the mastery of the knowledge, you start to move into creativity and curiosity and lateral thinking. So it becomes very, very different from like the plug and chug. And I saw this a lot when I was a professor. Students come in, they can memorize it all, but ask them what it means, and they have no idea.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is a shift in the landscape now, because we talked a little bit about like the the eminent software engineer who knows a lot. The as you know, the internet and knowledge and everything becomes more accessible, the key thing is not how much you know, because I can go to ChatGPT and it can tell me the same things that this engineer knows.
Right.
So he no longer has this corner on knowledge.
Right.
Nor does anyone. What becomes the functional skill is our ability to learn really quickly and assimilate whatever knowledge we're having to deal with. Could be any number of topics.
But you
And
leave something out. There's another piece to that that you talked about with curiosity. And I think when it comes to Chat GPT or AI, I think questioning is hugely important, and
yes,
formulating a really good question, really well-structured question.
right.
And that requires the curiosity.
And it requires, and here's I think where it really comes, like the rubber meets the road, it requires humble leadership, because these kinds of people who are very good at learning, they're also very good at asking questions, and that can make
Right.
people feel very, very insecure. Like
Yes.
when they challenge, these assumptions, which should be challenged, but they've become sacred cows in their industry or whatever the case is. Questioning things is a very risky proposition generally in the corporate environment, and the leadership should be creating this basically a safe space for more open-minded engagement around the topics.
But I think people conflate interrogation with questioning and curiosity.
Yes.
And that's where it goes off, kind of.
Right. And those are two different things. One is like, I've got an agenda that I'm trying to push, and I'm going to do that through questions. The other one is I'm genuinely curious about how this works, and I want to understand it. Two different things. You're right.
I think last question. What's one thing that you'd like to leave with people, something that they can take with them with regard to biomimicry, if they didn't get some of this, or just boil it down to something very simple, something that they can use to impact their leadership or interaction with other people?
I think it's a lesson that we've had for a long time now, is people in leadership are not superheroes. Their success is really going to be based on the people that they have working with them, and the nurturance of those people along some of these lines, cultivating curiosity, helping people communicate better, delegating with trust, and using your intelligence to help people. For example, when we're talking about a reflex arc, to say, okay, you have the personal autonomy to do this, but here are some guardrails. If we're starting to go outside of here, then you need to, elevate this in our corporate consciousness, as it were. I think some of the, and what we're generally talking about here is a mode of delegation that's very bidirectional in terms of communication and intentional nurturing and communication. So it's a leadership style. The idea, like the Steve Jobs model of leadership, okay, it worked in some senses, but in other senses, it's a tremendous liability. And there are not many people who are as good as he that can pull off the same results. Most people need the support of their teams.
Some people got stressed out by his delivery too, so.
Yes.
So,
he left a lot of hurt feelings in his wake.
well, with that, I'd like to thank you, Edwin, for joining us for this episode of Evolve. And before we sign off, just share with our audience how they can connect with you. You mentioned it earlier, you didn't say exactly how.
Yeah, so probably the best way to connect with me is either shoot me an email, edwin@edwinclamp.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Just put in my name, Edwin Clamp. I'd love to connect with people. I love talking to people about deep things and business challenges, especially the more difficult they are, the more I enjoy it. So hit me up.
All right, this has been Yvette Bethel and Edwin Clamp, and we would like to thank you for joining us for this episode of Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures.
Thank you for listening to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures. Learn more about our proprietary trust, leadership, and culture courses and certifications at the IFB Academy. You can check them out at organizationalsoul.learnworlds.com.